Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program. We sincerely appreciate your support. HI of Dallas, Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, Mosaic Family Services, Legacy Senior Communities, and World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to our museum members and our board members joining us for this evening. Thank you so much for your continued support of the museum. We couldn't put on programs like this without your support. As a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we are intimately familiar with the historical consequences of hatred and oppression, but we also have the responsibility to shine a spotlight on current human rights violations. Tonight's program addresses the ongoing persecution of the Uyghurs in China at the hands of their own government. Before we get started, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panel for tonight. Roshan Abbas is the founder and executive director of Campaign for Uyghurs, an organization that advocates for the human rights and democratic freedoms of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples oppressed by the Chinese regime. She has been an activist since her days at university in East Turkestan, where she helped organize pro-democracy protests. In 2018, her sister was abducted by the Chinese regime and illegally imprisoned in retaliation for Ms. Abbas's activism. Dr. Timothy Gross is Associate Professor of China Studies at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. His research on expressions of Uyghur ethno-national identities has been published in a number of academic journals, and he speaks and writes regularly on ethnic policy in Xinjiang. His first book on boarding schools and Uyghur students, Negotiating Inseparability, was published in 2019. And Dr. Sean Roberts is Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of the International Development Studies Program in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He is an anthropologist with regional expertise in Central Asia and has done extensive research on the Uyghur people. His first book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority, was published in 2020. And I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator tonight, Dr. Gregory H. Stanton. He is founding president of Genocide Watch and founder of the Cambodian Genocide Project and the Alliance Against Genocide. Dr. Stanton created the 10 Stages of Genocide educational framework that we use in our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery to teach the process of genocide. He drafted the UN Security Council resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and wrote the rules of procedure for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Dr. Stanton's previous roles include president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, James Farmer Professor of Human Rights at the University of Mary Washington, and research professor in genocide studies at George Mason University. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end of our program, so please use your Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen and type out and submit your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. And now it's my pleasure to turn the discussion over to Dr. Stanton and our panelists.
Thank you very much, Mary Pat. It's an honor to be here at this distinguished gathering, and especially to be with the Dallas Museum again. That has meant so much to me. The Dallas Museum and I have worked together for years now, and it was a huge honor that they chose the 10 Stages of Genocide as the structure for their exhibit on genocide. It is an extraordinarily creative presentation of the 10 stages, and I urge anyone who can to go and see it. This evening's discussion is about the Uyghur people of Xinjiang province in China. And as you may know, many of us who are genocide scholars, in fact, I'd say by far the majority of us, believe that the Uyghurs are currently the victims of genocide at the hands of the Chinese state. Tonight, we will discuss who are the Uyghurs, why have they been persecuted, and what can be done about it. Is it genocide? Can anything be done about genocide? Some of these questions will be the ones that we will ask tonight. But let's start at the beginning, and each panelist should please turn on their video and their mic, because I'm going to be asking questions that each of the panelists is actually an expert on, far more than I am. And so I'll be asking these questions so that they can respond and explain to us why these wonderful people, the Uyghurs, are being so persecuted and such victims of genocide right now. So let's start with the basics. And I'll first ask Rashan, in fact, to tell us about her people. Who are the Uyghurs? And how long have they lived in China? Where do they live?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stanton. The Uyghurs are a Turkic people who have resided in our historic homeland in Central Asia, which is north of Tibet, west of Mongolia, for thousands of years, and their homeland has been occupied by the Chinese Communist regime since 1949. They are culturally and ethically distinct from the Han Chinese. Uyghurs refer to their homeland as East Turkestan, which is a historical, geographical, and a symbolic name. The Chinese regime refers to it as Xinjiang. Full name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is only in the name. There is no any kind of autonomy. And the Xinjiang means new territory in Mandarin Chinese, which is insulting to Uyghurs and also incorrect. Now Beijing is using it as the home base for this current active genocide, and also as a starting point for its world domination through the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you so much. You can tell I'm an anthropologist, so I always believe that when telling or defining a people, you should first ask a person who is from that group. And that is why I asked Rashan to tell us about the Uyghurs, her people. I'd like now to open it up to everyone who's on the panel, really, to answer this question. Why have the Uyghurs been marked for persecution? You know, when did this persecution start? And Professor Roberts and Professor Gross, both of you should, I think, talk about your extensive research, really, about this, as well as Rashan. So I'll ask Sean Roberts to begin, perhaps.
Sure. Well, so I think that a lot of the relationship that Rashan relayed about the Uyghur people's relationship to China is a big part of the tension in the region. Among in the Chinese state officially claims that this region has been an indivisible part of China forever. And although it talks about the idea of a multi-ethnic state, the nation building project of the Chinese state is very much mono-ethnic in a lot of ways. And I think that that's part of the the tension in the region that has been gaining since, well, really since the region became a part of the Qing dynasty in the mid 18th century, the Qing Empire, and then became much more an integral part of the empire in the 1880s. But especially in the 20th and now the 21st century, there's been a growing kind of tension between Uyghurs and the state. And it's really mostly about, in my opinion, it's about to whom this region belongs. And so when I think about what's happening to them now, I often draw parallels to what's happened to indigenous peoples in other places, because the Uyghurs have a very close attachment to their land. I don't think that it's impossible for them to be part of a multi-ethnic China, but the Chinese state has not really provided them with that opportunity.
Thank you so much. And Professor Gross, what sort of cultural characteristics are there of the Uyghurs that would make them subject to persecution, especially here in China?
Well, as Rashawn stated earlier, culturally, linguistically, religiously, their kind of ethnic markers or those pillars of their identity are vastly different than those pillars that make up really the scaffolding of Han identity. In particular, is the Turkic language, Uyghur language, and Islam, which have fused with this ethno-national identity. So it's hard to separate cultural elements with how they view themselves as a nation. And as we see right now, this sense of nationhood, or this sense of nationalism is conflicting with that of kind of this multi-ethnic nationalism that's imagined by the Chinese Communist Party, and that's predicated primarily on Han Chinese cultural norms and values.
So in some ways, you could say that this project of the communist regime, the Chinese Han communist regime, is a kind of colonialism, isn't it? It's very much like what we did to Native Americans, and what European powers did in Africa, and so forth and so on. They're trying to take over the culture of an entire people. And so, speaking as a person who studied genocide all of his career, that is a perfect recipe for genocide. When you try to extinguish another culture, you wind up also having to commit genocide. That's what we did to the Native Americans here in the United States. It's what, of course, many countries in Africa suffered, the Belgians against the Congolese and so forth. But what is especially difficult here, isn't it, is that because China and East Turkestan, the Uyghur area, are directly in contact with each other. This is a sort of internal colonialism in which all you have to do is go across the border and there are the people that you want to dominate. So what is happening now? What are the ways in which the Chinese are trying to accomplish this domination in this area? So I'll open that to everyone, really, because it's so interesting how the Chinese are proceeding with this.
Can I just quickly add a couple words to what Tim and Sean said very correctly. On top of that, when you ask why have the Uyghurs been marked for this genocide, Xi Jinping is basically seeking to bring China back to the days of the Cultural Revolution. And also he believes that he has the right to define what being Chinese means. He's placing Han ethnic identity as defined by him as the only acceptable identity in China. And combining that with the chauvinistic racism against all other ethnicities. And anyone who goes against Xi Jinping or the Communist Party can be just called anti-Chinese. And also he has taken China in a frightening ultra-nationalistic direction. So if you ask, what is happening to Uyghurs now? While China is, while the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, outlining all the religious practice in the guise of fighting extremism, they are waging a war on Islam and waging a war on all religions, and also waging a war against the Uyghurs, just like Sean's recent book, China's War on Uyghurs. Practice of religion is completely outlawed, and all aspects of normal, any kind of ethnic and the religious practices are banned and being called as illegal religious activities. And also forced marriage of the Uyghur women to Han Chinese men, mass rape, I call it, because the Chinese regime announced that they are sending 1.1 million Han Chinese cadres to Uyghur homes to live inside of their houses and share beds with those Uyghur women. I call that government-sponsored mass rape, and the complete Orwellian surveillance, like what's described in 1984, and the forced sterilization, forced transfer of children to Han Chinese families, and also Uyghur children sending to government-run orphanages, and sexual torture in the camps, mental and physical abuses, brainwashing, organ harvesting, and the crematorias are being built next to those concentration camps. So these are but a few of the genocidal crimes of the Chinese Communist regime. The CCP has made life for Uyghurs and the other Turkic people living hell, and many are not coming out alive from prisons and the concentration camps.
And you have just stated that this is genocide. I am an international lawyer and also, head of Genocide Watch, and I must agree with you. I believe that the Chinese have violated every single one of the 5 basic acts of genocide that are enumerated in the Genocide Convention. The first is killing members of the group. They've clearly done that. The second is causing serious mental or physical harm to members of the group. Well, that's happened too. And the third is creating conditions for the group that are intended to destroy them as a group. In other words, that all these re-education camps and everything else are basically to transform them into, another kind of person. But then we get to 2 that are just so clear that you can't even deny them. The Article 5 in the Article 5D in the convention says preventing births within the group. And you have already said forced sterilization, but there are other ways in which they're preventing births. Is that right, Rushan?
Yes, actually, they are doing everything, every condition of the genocide in the convention is being met. They are doing everything they can, not just sterilizing the Uyghur women, forced abortions, but they are forcing Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese, so the Uyghur children are no longer to be born.
And indeed, I've read also that there is a forced emplacement of IUDs in Uyghur women. And these are IUDs that cannot be removed except by a doctor. That is a form of preventing births as well, isn't it?
Yes, and also when you look at, separating the young people in the forced labor facilities, taking them to concentration camps and sending them in China proper, that's also mandatory birth control, basically.
Right. And then, of course, the final of the five attributes, acts of genocide, is taking the children of the group away from the group. And that is exactly what they're doing, isn't it? They're
Yes.
taking them off to schools where they're forced to speak Han Chinese. They can't even speak their own language. That, by the way, is something we Americans should especially be concerned about, because that is what we did to our own Native American population. And that was genocide, to take away the children, not allow them to be brought up with their own language and so forth. And that is happening right now in China to the Uyghurs. Now, I have contributed more than I should have as a moderator, but I had to jump in there just to make clear these are the acts of genocide that are spelled out in the Genocide Convention. So let's move on then to is the news of what's happening to the Uyghurs getting out? Can you tell us, Rushan, about your sister's disappearance, for instance?
Yes, my sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, a retired medical doctor and a peaceful, non-political person, and had always served society well in her profession. On September 2018, I took a part in a panel at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., where I spoke about the conditions of the camps and the Chinese Communist Party's genocidal crimes against Uyghurs, while outlining the fate of my in-laws who had all disappeared in 2017. And Sean Roberts was also on that panel that day. 6 days after this panel, my own sister and my maternal aunt both disappeared from two separate towns, more than 900 miles away from each other on the exact same day, just 6 days after that panel that Sean and I took part. When I spoke out about their abduction, a few months later, my aunt was released, but there was absolutely no news on my sister. But when I continued to speak out about my sister and her disappearance while I was carrying her picture and everywhere I go, I was accused by the Chinese state media of stealing someone else's photo to fabricate a missing relative. And I was being accused for spreading false rumors. Later, after our family received independent information that my sister had been given a prison sentence on false charges last Christmas, on December 25th, 2020, we held a press conference to condemn this extrajudicial atrocity. Then, and only then, did the Chinese Foreign Ministry acknowledge her, confirming her harsh sentencing in a Foreign Ministry's press conference. They openly contradict their previous lies, but this is a typical actions of the Chinese Communist Party. We have not had any proof of life for 34 months now. My nieces are tormented, trying to raise their young children here in the United States while desperately searching for the news about their mother. Unfortunately, our story is not one of the unique cases. Akida Polat, our outreach director at Campaign for Uyghurs, her mother, Raila Dawood, Dr. Raila Dawood, who was educated in the United States, prominent scholar, disappeared almost 4 years ago, and there's absolutely no news of her. And recently, we heard from through Radio Free Asia that she was sentenced for life. For what, you know? For her being an Uyghur, basically. It's very difficult to obtain any news in a timely manner or at all because of the lack of transparency on the part of the Chinese authorities, the information blockade by the regime, and the environment of the fear that prevent people from speaking freely, even with loved ones. And I am one of the best examples of the CCP's retaliation against those people who spoke out. So people look at me and they are afraid of coming forward and speaking out. I have been a US citizen since 1994. and been living in the United States for 32 years since 1989. Yet the Chinese Communist Party's long arm reaches across the ocean and ravages my heart by taking my sister hostage.
One of the genocides that I have most been interested in and lived right after it in Cambodia. The very same, and by the way, the Cambodian Communist Party, as you may know, was heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party and Maoism. But that sort of collective punishment, punishment of a whole family, was also characteristic in Cambodia. And all kinds of reasons were given to me, like that then a relative couldn't take out revenge or things of that sort. But it is a kind of a collective punishment of a person to have the whole family be punished. I wanted to ask also Professor Gross and Professor Roberts, what other kinds of ways is the Chinese state persecuting the Uyghurs? For instance, there are Uyghurs who go live in other cities in China.
Yeah, I'll chime in first. And I think, earlier in our conversation, you correctly brought the example in of the treatment of Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, and Indigenous people in Australia. And when we look at the current the kind of consistent and constant violence against Uyghurs and Kazakhs in the Uyghur homeland, we see a lot of the same strategies. It's almost as if they're using the same very violent playbook. For example, there's an attempt to weaken connections to the land, and because they've literally destroyed some Uyghur communities and then have moved them to high-rise apartments. There's a campaign called the 3 News campaign, and a beautification, quote unquote, project that requires Uyghurs to essentially reorganize the spatial elements of their home. There's been a voluntary boarding school system at a national level since the year 2000, which currently enrolls 10,000 children, most of whom are Uyghur and Kazakh. And then, things as personal as names, right? So, officially, Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other minorities are provided names, their names that are kind of Chineseified or opinionified. And again, this was the same sort of strategies used by the federal government in the US by giving Native Americans, quote unquote, Christian names, right? It's about completely altering and transforming identities. And I wanted to make a quick and a very, very minor correction to something Rushan said, and that is there's actually a lot of information coming out from China about what is going on. And that's where I've really devoted my last 3 years. And what we know beyond any doubt whatsoever, and looking at Chinese sources, especially blogs by individuals, mostly Han individuals, who are sent down to Uyghur villages, is that countless number of people have been detained arbitrarily, that these detentions have resulted in the separation of children from their parents. Many times, both parents, in some cases, they're able to live with a near relative, a grandparent, or an aunt and uncle. Other times, they are placed in state care. We also know that underneath the official slogan of health, that Uyghur women are now subjected to medical screenings, and it appears now, and again, this has happened within the last 2 years, that the quote unquote preferred method of birth control is IUDs, which I think is really, really concerning. That this would happen so suddenly. And so again, this comes directly from Chinese sources. And this is what we know without any reasonable, beyond a reasonable doubt, Chinese officials explaining and describing the situation in their own words.
Professor Revers, can you tell us also about two other aspects that are really concerning to me? One is organ harvesting, and the other is the use of artificial intelligence. I would be very interested if you have some comments about those.
Yeah, let me start by kind of noting and building on something you mentioned, that this does look a lot like other things we've seen in the past. But I think what's particularly remarkable about the fate of the Uyghurs at the moment is that it also benefits from new technologies that can assert control, essentially. I mean, I think a lot of if we look at the progression of events, it's becoming clearer and clearer now that initially most of the Uyghur intelligentsia were put in prisons, including people who were political, political members of the party who were in local governance and so on. And that initially cut that portion of the population out of the equation, essentially kind of an elitist, I've heard it called before. But then also by putting all these people into mass internment camps and having at the same time very sophisticated electronic surveillance, including a massive database where they could essentially make electronic profiles of every Uyghur and use those as a means to decide who went to internment and who didn't. That created such an atmosphere of fear that a lot of these other things that the state is trying to unroll in the region in terms of changing the territory, changing villages and practices and all of this, people have to comply with it because they know that the consequences, if they don't comply with it, is to be sent to an internment camp. And they know that they're being constantly watched. And so I think that it's been kind of a immobilization of the entire people. And very much the intent seems to, at the very least, get at this point that Raphael Lemkin kind of talks about as the core principle in genocide, which is to get rid of the idea of them being a people themselves, the solidarity, and that includes also breaking down of social capital and all kinds of other things. I haven't done much research on the organ harvesting. I don't know if one of my colleagues would like to.
Sure, I'd be very interested. I'm very interested also if you had any more comments about their use of American artificial intelligence and facial recognition software, that it's outlawed to send it to China, and yet I think the Chinese are getting it. So that is a concern.
And I think, I don't know, well, I mean, recently there's been some legal changes to this, but a lot of it has happened through joint research. A lot of it also relates to the fact that even products that are not fully made in China contain parts that are made in China, right? And so the supply chain issues are very, very complex. And they're a very important part of this story because one of the things that the state has been doing continually since 2017 and even earlier, but seems to be ramping up now, is placing a lot of Uyghurs in residential factory units to remove them from their villages, put them in a Han cultural and Chinese language milieu. And they have restricted movement, and essentially this has been designated by the US government, at least, as forced labor. And that brings up all kinds of questions because parts of Apple computers may be infected with this forced labor in terms of the supply chain. Lots of clothing, because this region of China is producing a substantial amount of the world's cotton, and also is doing a lot of the processing there as well.
Fascinating. That is really chilling, in fact. I mean, my goodness. So it's just what they're doing is essentially imposing not only genocide, but also slavery. Slavery, that is, well, it's so horrifying. It's almost hard for most people to even believe it. And I want to ask you about that. How is it that Chinese have been answering these charges of genocide? What are their modes of denial, if you will?
Well, so, a lot of what's I find very interesting is the spokespeople of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular respond often to accusations, and they refer, rather than completely denying what they're doing, they refer to things that the United States has done or other countries that are criticizing them. And it's almost as if the state is owning what they're doing and saying, but you guys did it too. And this has come up several times where the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has lashed out at what the US and Canada has done to indigenous peoples. Not very long ago, there was a spokesperson put out all kinds of information about the finding of mass graves in Canada at the territory of residential schools and so on. So that's part of it. I don't know. Tim is following a lot of government sources. Tim, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, most of the sources that I engage with are, coming from individuals with an official capacity, but they're not speaking officially. And what I find interesting is that publicly, Chinese officials will describe, for example, the internment camps as vocational centers, but it's quite clear in how they're being described on the ground that these are facilities for punishment. In fact, the term they describe the re-education personnel are the same terms to describe those who have been given prison sentences and those who have been detained and who are held in a type of criminal facility, a detention center. So again, these are looking at people who are actually in the process of sifting through the population, deciding who is a quote unquote at-risk individual, and then who is sent to these various facilities of detainment. And again, they're being referred to not as students, but as more or less as criminals, at the very least as detainees. Though officially, Chinese diplomats will say that this is vocational training, and they're providing these very useful skills, both vocational skills and language skills that will allow these individuals to become successful. Of course, the inconvenient truth behind this explanation is that we see Uyghur elite, those with PhDs, MDs, lawyers, etc., who have already succeeded in the Chinese education system, also being swallowed up by this mass internment.
Can I just add a couple things to that? When China's response when they confront about the genocide, it is the same as its response to the pandemic, to its history in Tiananmen Square, to the brutalities in Hong Kong against the peaceful protesters, to anything basically. Conceal, deny, and punish the truth tellers. Initially, they denied the existence of the camps, like what the team just said. They changed their story to say those are the vocational training centers. And then they said when that was proven false with the points that Tim just mentioned, many of the scholars and famous writers and the business owners, and then they claimed that they were fighting extremism and the international community shouldn't interfere. There are constant contradictions and the lies being presented without being confronted or pushed back against. My disappointment is actually the silence and complicity of the international communities. Many countries and the people are becoming also the victims of CCP's disinformation and the false narratives, but some of them are intentionally denying the genocide to appease the Chinese Communist regime. And even in many countries, even here in the United States, scholars and the famous celebrities, the mainstream media, and look at Hollywood celebrities, they are so vocal against any kind of social injustice. Where are they now? And even NBA. So when the perpetrator has the money and the power, they choose to be complicit, basically. Being silent now is being complicit in this Uyghur genocide. I would like to say at the end, one of the quote that I like from Elie Wiesel, who said, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." You know, sometimes we must interfere when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and the sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever a man or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must at that moment become the center of the universe. And this is the time actually for all of us to take action and stop this genocide.
One of my colleagues in this field that I'm in, genocide studies, William Chavez, wrote an article that was a pure case of denial. A lot of people don't know Bill. I do know him. I know him very, very well. And he basically denies genocide whenever it occurs, even though he is supposedly a world expert on genocide. He wrote the treatise, you know. But the truth is, he only thinks there were 3 genocides: the Armenian, the Holocaust, and the Rwandan genocide. He denies that it was genocide in Cambodia. He denies that it was genocide in Darfur. He denies, you know, that the Holodomor in Ukraine was a genocide. I mean, this man is a genocide denier. And he and Jeffrey, I'm sorry, I'm coming up with a very famous scholar at Columbia, wrote it up. Yes, that's right, op-ed denying that this is genocide. Well, I went through that, and I'm about to publish this. I went through it because I had written an article a few years back during the Darfur genocide, and it's still going on, by the way, taking apart these denial arguments and saying, okay, these are the common tactics to denial. And what I've done with the Chavez article is now I've shown that he uses every one of them. So the first is to question the statistics. The second is to attack the motivations of the truth tellers. In fact, that is using the technique that Professor Roberts has already talked about. And you can say that, after all, how can you criticize us when you did these things? You can claim that any deaths were inadvertent, accidental. You can also claim that the victims, are somehow a threat. And that is what they're doing when they claim they're terrorists or extremists. And that takes advantage, of course, of the world Islamophobia problem. I mean, they really are applying that. You then can, say, well, this is really a problem of, international relations. So let's not upset the peace process. Let's get along with each other, after all. That's the way we, by the way, denied the genocide that the Ottoman Turks committed against the Armenians for so many years, because we didn't want to lose the use of that air base in southeastern Turkey. And you can, of course, also claim that it just doesn't fit the definition of genocide. Well, we've just gone through the definition earlier and showed that, in fact, it does fit the definition, what is happening to the Uyghurs. So all of these forms of denial are being used. What I had one other question about this. Are any groups in China speaking out, or at least trying to support the Uyghurs in this terrible genocide?
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
It's nearly impossible to speak up in China due to the repressive political climate. Even a social media post on a topic can get you arrested. But we do know that there are those who are sympathetic due to individuals leaking documents and even helping to get information to the international community in some other ways. You know, for example, in the recent PBS Frontline documentary, a Han Chinese businessman actually volunteered to help obtain secret camera footage to show what's happening to the Uyghur people. So there are many obstacles to being an upstander, but we must continue to call on the Chinese people to do what's right, and as well as to do what we ourselves can in operating from a democratic country with freedom of speech. So we would like to have the Chinese communities in the West, in America, Canada, and other places to stop this genocide and speak out as Chinese people.
One of the big problems too is the short-sightedness of news media. You know, they have an attention span of about a week. You know, all of a sudden they'll say something about it, but then you don't hear about it. After 6 months, it's gone. So one question I have on this is, what has been the response of other nations? You know, I know the US at least has 2 secretaries of state now who have declared this is genocide. I must say that is better than we've done on most other genocides. But then what, on the other hand, there's countries like Canada where the parliament just voted down a resolution that said it was genocide. So the denial is pretty widespread. What should we be doing about this? And I leave this to all of you, because I think that this requires a lot of creativity, really, if we're going to think about what we can do. What should our governments do? And then what can we do individually?
If you look at what has been the response from the other nations, you know, the response, as if typical with genocide response, has been extremely slow. The United States has had a strong response, as you mentioned, and the bipartisan support on Uyghur issues, which is very significant in the current political climate, but more actions is needed. And that there's a significant shift towards an allied approach to confronting the CCP, but because of Beijing's debt trap diplomacy remains a huge obstacle, as many countries indebted to China and are speaking up to defend the CCP's genocide. And most significantly, that's what we are seeing in the Muslim majority nations, especially like Pakistan, that should be the first to condemn it. The CCP spends, you know, billions of dollars on propaganda campaigns, and it will take continued coordinated strategic efforts to combat the CCP's lies and stop this before the reality of the Uyghurs become the future for all of the world. Because now this is not just about the Uyghurs. This is not just defending the Uyghurs. It's about defending the free world, defending the democracy. as we what we are seeing unfold is their colonization of vulnerable countries, as well as taking over the freedom and the democracy. So, when you ask how can we help on the individuals, organizations, and the government level, there are a few things that can be done. The one, as an individual, anyone can help to raise awareness. They don't have to be Uyghur. They don't have to be an activist or, speaking, doing something, getting involved. Just follow our on social media or subscribe on a mailing list or share the information you are learning from scholars like Sean and the team. And but unfortunately, sadly, it still remains the case that most people are unaware of the severity of this genocide, while the Chinese Communist Party is using the social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and the more to attack and dehumanize us, the activists or victims of this genocide. So it is extremely important. And secondly, please donate to human rights organizations like ours. Campaign for Uyghurs are taking on a giant in the CCP with very, very few resources. So we desperately need a financial support to be able to have enough staff or opportunities to fight to stop this genocide. So you can go to our website and support us by donating to our organization, and also sign up on our website to our mailing list, so you can keep yourself updated to the current events and happenings. And the three as the organizations, you can hold events like this one and mobilize communities and educate the public. You can also mobilize groups to advocate to remove the Confucius Institutes and the many other programs that's funded by Chinese Communist parties, spreading Chinese Communist parties ideology and propaganda at the US universities. And also on the government level, we all have the opportunity to advocate to support legislation like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or the Uyghur SOS bill, or even in Dallas, Texas, to issue a genocide resolution like what has recently passed in Harris County.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Very practical. And by the way, would you give us your website address so that people can look up your organization? That would be very helpful. What should we look for? Rishan. I guess she's silenced right now. There it is.
Campaignforuyghurs.org. Yeah, that's
Campaignforuyghurs.org. Very, very simple. Well, do others? Yeah, go ahead. Yes, Sean, go ahead.
I'm just going to mention, I think that in many ways, this is a problem that only the Chinese government can solve. And so it seems to me that it's very important that there are economic pressure applied, whether that's through states. And I have kind of not a lot of confidence in states applying that pressure. So I've been a big advocate for the idea of more grassroots boycotting, thinking about divesting, major institutions like universities, pensions funds, and so on, invest regularly in high tech that might be intertwined with this. And there are some very good efforts being undertaken to, in particular, put pressure on corporations that have in their supply chains Uyghur forced labor. And I think that that's one lever that may be able to convince powerful people in China that what the state is doing in the Uyghur region is not in the state's best interest and is only going to hurt China globally.
Thank you. Do you have any other suggestions, Professor Gross?
No, but I think it's, I mean, nothing, substantial or anything specific. I think
Yeah.
that, what we should be doing is building coalitions on a small scale and on a large scale. And one way we can do that is showing people who might be unaware of the situation or might be skeptical of the situation, the facts as the Chinese government has stated them in their own documents. And then that I think removes the discussion from U.S. geopolitics. It removes the discussion on those in quote unquote Western governments who are insisting on preventing quote unquote China's rise. So you engage people at the individual level and you introduce them with the situation on the ground as it's described by the Chinese government itself.
Fascinating. And I used to write UN resolutions when I was in the State Department. And one of the things we found sometimes useful, probably rather difficult in this case, in the Security Council at least, is we would create commissions of inquiry to investigate when we just had a genocide or something. It may be that a commission of inquiry out of the Security Council is impossible because, of course, China has a veto there. But China does not have a veto in the Human Rights Council, and a fact-finding mission could be appointed there, to really investigate this. And even if they can't get into China to do it, which I would imagine, they can still carry out the investigation and write a remarkable report, just the way they did for that Human Rights Council did for Myanmar. A 444-page indictment of the Myanmar government with lots of facts and lots of footnotes. So we have some questions that have come in from people in the audience. In one, we have a question here that is really interesting and important. Have any human rights or aid groups been allowed to visit Uyghur cities or the internment camps?
There's been some journalists who were brought to internment camps, and most recently there was a lot of interesting reporting because it seemed that during the height of the pandemic, it was essentially nobody going to the region to report on what was happening, and just recently the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China had an open call asking journalists to come. They reported that they had very little access to people. They reported there was a lot of fear, but they also reported that there seemed to be an attempt by the state to normalize the situation and make it look as if everything was normal. But I think that so far there's not been any NGOs allowed in to the region. There's been as you mentioned, the UN Human Rights Council has the head of it has recently said that she really wants to do an investigation this year, and I am hoping that that's something that we do see happen, because I think that's really critical, because the misinformation that is gathering against what we've been discussing is really frustrating to see. And I think that without a real independent body out of the UN, there's going to be people still very skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Also, we have another question here. Has the Chinese government employed similar strategies of persecution against other groups? Are the Uyghurs unique in this?
The Chinese regime has been persecuting the Tibetans and the Southern Mongolians, and ever since the occupation of our homeland in 1949. They have been using all different type of tactics to oppress people. But this time it's different because it's intent to exterminate the Uyghur people. Basically, a lot of things that they are using to Uyghur people today is actually unprecedented when you look at it. There has been a former Chinese Minister of Defense, Chi Haotian, gave a speech in 2004 on the CCP, on how the Chinese Communist Party must learn from the mistakes which led to the Nazis losing, even referencing that they are the Chinese Communist Party is superior to the Nazis. The Chinese regime has carefully studied histories they called mistakes, and saying that why, what led the Nazi Germany and the Japan to losing the World War II. But in their view, the mistakes worth examining are what led to the Nazi Germany losing, as I said, and they were trying to come up with the final solution to exterminate Uyghur people. And that's why it frustrates me when we have, people still continues to argue on if this is genocide or not, while people continue to treat this as a matter of academic debate. Uyghurs are dying, and academic analysis can come after the fact. And we are charged with preventing this genocide while it's happening. So it's really painful as a Uyghur to see and watch those arguments.
And by the way, even so-called experts on genocide like Bill Chavez say, oh, the Genocide Convention has these other, aspects. I mean, these other acts of genocide, like taking the children away and preventing births and so forth. Yes, but actually, let's face it, really, we have to have mass killing. In other words, they want to ignore the letter of the law, the convention itself. This is a man who is supposedly a lawyer. Well, that is a very common attitude, that it isn't genocide unless you have mass killing. And in what you just said, Rashan, is an interesting example of it, because the Chinese may have studied history and realized that if they had really massive killing, well, then the world would probably pay attention.
Exactly.
But if you can do it slowly, through taking away the children, through preventing the births, through totally extirpating the culture, re-educating everyone, it's still genocide under the Genocide Convention, but most people won't even recognize it as such. I have one other question I want to ask. It came in also. A person has written, this ongoing genocide clearly dictates that we can no longer say never again, because it's happening every day. And of course, that's something Genocide Watch says. Instead of never again, it's been again and again. And will the US government and our many other governments set aside commercial interests and try to do something more about this? That is the one question that I think is at the heart of this, because so much of our trade relations and so forth, depend on getting along with the Chinese government. And that, by the way, I can tell you from being inside the State Department, that is the default position of State Department personnel, is to get along with whatever country you're supposed to be going to. And so you get along with the government. So you're not very critical usually. So that's something that really worries me about the self-interest of nations who might not want to criticize China.
Yes, that's why passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is essential, and we have a part in that. We possess the system to engage as the constitution and the consumers. So it's up to us. The United Nations has been rendered ineffective by China's participation on the Human Rights Council. What a joke, they are sitting in the Human Rights Council while conducting genocide. But pressure can be applied through the member states, which is why educating the world and educating the public while a large task is vital. And also, we must decouple from China. How do you engage or have a friendly dialogue with a government conducting active genocide?
One of the other questions that's come in is, why aren't there widespread protests all across Europe and America? Why don't people march in the streets about this? This is a genocide. I mean, at least we had marches, on Darfur. And yet there doesn't seem to be this happening these days.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, go ahead, Sean,
go ahead,
sorry.
Roxanne.
Let me just make it quick. Unfortunately, the Uyghur cause is known from like top to bottom. We don't have Dalai Lama. We don't have like known like a community, they don't know, and they find it difficult to believe something so evil could be, happening right now. So that's why it's so important to educate. Let me just give you a quick example of in UK. We were in the UK for the Uyghur Tribunal, and we spoke to some of the Muslim leaders there in person with our personal experience. And we asked them to do a protest on July 1st. And there's like 500-600 Muslims who are protesting in the front of Chinese embassy on the July 1st. So we have a lot of work to do. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I was gonna say that there has been some protests and involving people who are new to the Uyghur people and have just learned about it and have been outraged. But there is, I think, a certain muting of what's happening. Part of that has to do with the pandemic, and part of it has to do with, I think, a lot of people. Part of it has to do with social media and disinformation, and the fact that a lot of people are skeptical. Even though we've seen every major international newspaper I can think of has done extensive coverage of this. And in fact, most of the journalistic awards in the last 5 or I guess 4 years at least have gone to people who've written about what's happening and having dug up facts and so on. But media has gone into this mode of believing that mainstream media is fake news, and that's really hurting the cause, I think. And I've seen that from both the left and the right politically in America. And so people are thinking, this could just be an excuse to go after China and create a new Cold War. This is, made up by the CIA and all kinds of crazy conspiracies. But people, I think, particularly right now, are more prone than ever to these kinds of conspiracy theories.
Here's a really good question that I would especially like to ask here, having lived in Cambodia and having seen this myself, my own eyes. Why have so many genocides taken place in communist countries? What's the nature of communism that leads to genocide?
With communism, which mandates that morality be dictated by corruptible humans, and that there's an enormous potential for problems with communism, which mandates the, for China, basically worth noting that China is not truly a communist authority, but the authority allows to select a few to profit off of their own version of capitalism, and the capitalism plays out much more intensively, basically, essentially. And I guess all communist countries are being the dictatorship, totalitarian system. Maybe that's why.
And the state defines the morality. One of the things that really always struck me, because I've read a lot of Marx and others, is the communists believe the end justifies the means. And so if the end is, to establish some kind of utopian communist society, then, well, if you have to kill people to do it, well, then that's justified. And that's actually not just communism, but any kind of utopian system that has that kind of absolutism in it is going to result in genocide. Colonialism had the same impact because the French and Spanish and a lot of others thought that they were civilizing the world. So what we have here is a case where communist leaders believe they have the answer to all of human problems. And so part of it is going to be the state will dictate morality, and the state, in fact, will replace God. That's at the heart of it. That's why they hate religion. We have one last question, really. What would be the next legislative steps that you would like to see the U.S. Congress do after the Forced Labor Act? And what other concrete steps can the U.S. do about this?
Have a special envoy for Uyghurs at the State Department.
Thank you. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, I definitely think they need to make the immigration process for those who have been affected or families affected by these state atrocities to be more seamless, to have less obstacles to gain asylum if they're seeking asylum. I know far too many cases that have been unsuccessful in trying to gain asylum in the United States.
Good. Well, we really, I think, have covered what we hope to in this panel today, and have, I hope, informed a lot of people about this terrible genocide that is underway in China against the Uyghurs. I do hope that more and more people will take action, and I want to thank all of you, because each of you has been an activist on this issue. And that is what it takes. It takes knowing the problem and then knowing what to do about it. And all of you have thought this through, and we are so grateful to you for sharing your views and the facts with this audience this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, I can't say it any better than Greg did, so I will just say thank you one more time on behalf of the museum, for all of you for joining us tonight, for sharing your expertise, Rushan, for sharing your personal stories and connection. Like Greg said, I think you all took an incredibly complex issue and really laid it out well for our audience tonight. I know we have a lot more to think about as well. So thank you again to you all, to everyone watching tonight. Everyone stay well and stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good evening.
Inviting us.